China is becoming a massive economic growth story. In recent years, this manufacturing juggernaut has overtaken Japan to become the world's #2 economy. Many project it'll become bigger than the United States within the next few decades. They're the world's factory, producing goods relatively cheaply. It means lower prices for Canadian consumers, and the massive economic growth has created an insatiable demand for the kind of resources Canada has an abundance of, like oil. They've even sent astronauts into space. Chang 1, Heavenly Place 1, a space station launched by the Chinese 2 years ago. But many have doubts about China's ongoing success. Massive population, much of which still lives in poverty. Cheap manufacturing, a low-margin business built on the backs of cheap Chinese labor, an arrangement workers can tolerate only for so long. And there's been, well, some disturbing signs that China's centralized communist government has actually been building infrastructure just to maintain momentum. Cities where nobody lives. So you have entire city areas completely empty, like ghost towns. And now Beijing is making an even bigger bet on cities, a massive urbanization plan. The vision? The Bohai Economic Rim, a cityscape of, believe it or not, 260 million people. To put that in perspective, the Tokyo area, currently the largest in the world, with 37 million. Our next guest sees a huge risk from this gamble, one that could have a big impact on Canada. So it's time for another red alert. Joining us is Gordon G. Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, I know that the Chinese government doesn't care very much about human rights. We know what they do to the air. We know what the lifespan is of the average Chinese. We know about the problems with lung diseases, et cetera, et cetera. But I just cannot imagine how brutal it would be to live in a city where you have 260 million neighbors.
Yeah, it's just enormous. These numbers that China's talking about are things that we have never seen in history. They're talking about small cities of 25 million. But the real thing here is that they want to move 250 million peasants off the farms in the next 12 years into cities. And this is just brutal social engineering. They're doing it by taking peasants' land away from them, often without adequate compensation, and then basically moving them to cities where they have no work. This is going to be a real problem. You know, we see all of this creation of new infrastructure as growth, but actually it hurts growth because essentially what's going on is that China's paying for it with massive borrowing, taxation, and also forced transfers from households, such as low deposit rates. So this is actually a negative for the Chinese economy, not a positive.
And once again, this puts into doubt the idea that China can continue to grow at 6 or 7 or 8%. I mean, one almost has to come to the conclusion that all the numbers are being fudged and will be fudged even more going forward to the point where the Chinese economy isn't growing at all.
Yeah, I mean, Beijing claims 7.7% growth for the first quarter of this year. But when you look at the most reliable indicator of Chinese economic activity, which is electricity, we're looking at an economy growing between 2 and 3%. And if you subtract out economically useless production, which is technically gross domestic product, like all those ghost cities that you referred to, we're talking to about an economy that is perhaps 0.1%. And that's why right now China has this liquidity crisis this month, which is causing incredible problems in the interbank market where we're seeing banks default. We're seeing spikes of interest rates, and we're seeing the central government in Beijing not able to raise money with failed bill auctions. So this is a real story right now, and I don't know how China gets out of it because there are no ways forward for them.
Gordon, I grew up in the factory district of Montreal, so I didn't understand anything about sophisticated economics. I just understood what the order sheet was all about. And when there was nothing on the order sheet, our economy sucked. Here's my question. Are the Chinese ordering less stuff?
Well, look at it. You know, their exports in May increased by 1.0%. And that number was probably inflated with some fake export invoices. And more important, Their imports were down 0.3%, showing a lack of domestic demand. You know, Beijing comes out with all of these numbers showing very robust retail sales growth, but those numbers don't mean anything because they also include government procurement and unsold inventory. So China's consumerism is not as big as the government says it is. And I think this is a real problem because the only way forward for China on the long term is a consumption-based economy. But consumption as a percentage of the Chinese economy has been declining. It is now at about 35, 36%. And that's the lowest rate of contribution to economy anywhere in the world. So this is going to be an issue for China. They cannot make the reforms that are necessary to increase consumption.
And I gather these many millions of people who will be herded off the land, Mao Zedong style, into these gargantuan size cities will be probably just as hungry in the cities as they were on the farms without very much work. They're not going to be the world's greatest consumers.
No, they're not going to be. A lot of people speculate that the peasants who are moved into the cities and who can't find work, who are generally the older and the middle-aged peasants, you know, essentially are going to be saving because they realize that there's no safety net under them. And so consumption is not going to increase because these people move over. You know, the Chinese technocrats look at foreign countries and they say that, you know, the developed ones have much larger urbanization rates than China has, so China needs more cities. But in the West, these cities grew organically. They didn't grow by fiat from people in planning ministries. And that's the real problem for China because all of this urbanization is not going to create growth in the long run unless it is propelled organically. And so far, it has not been.
Well, people go to where the work is, but if they're forced to go to places where the work isn't, yeah, that's called a dictatorship, and it doesn't make very much sense economically either. Gordon, what's your message to countries like Canada and Australia? These are countries that have made all kinds of projections about selling their resources to China.
You know, China is at a point where it's starting to dump commodities. We've seen a decline in commodities across the board this year, and that's largely because of a lack of demand in China. I think that this is long-term because the Chinese can't solve their long-term economic problems. And what this really means at the end of the day is that countries that depend on selling raw materials to China, and it also includes the U.S. because we sell a lot of commodities and agricultural products as well, they're going to get hurt because the market's just not going to be there. And countries like Canada, Australia, and all the rest of them are going to have to find markets outside of China if they want to avoid sharp falls.
Gordon, I've got a little over a minute left. I know you've got a belly full on Edward Snowden. Go.
I think the important thing here is that China did not let Snowden go to Russia. China encouraged Snowden to leave. We know this because one of Snowden's lawyers in Hong Kong, Albert Ho, said that he was approached by intermediaries from Beijing who told Ho that he should tell Snowden to leave. This is a bigger story than I think that we're looking at right now because Beijing has some pretty bad intent here.
And just in 20 seconds, what would that intent be, do you think?
I think Snowden was either working for Chinese intelligence or working alongside Chinese intelligence. What we have learned recently in the last 2 weeks points in that direction. Not that Snowden was a whistleblower. He's not. He was a spy in all probability.
So when he ended up in the arms of the Chinese a few days ago, that was not a coincidence, Gordon?
Not a coincidence at all, because probably Chinese intelligence, either directly or indirectly, when he was in Hawaii, tipped him to leave because NSA was closing in on him. That's an important story that needs to be run down.
Gordon Chang, thank you very much.
Thank you.